The day I walked into Sunset Manor as the new owner instead of a discarded patient was the sweetest revenge I've ever tasted. 6 months earlier, my own daughter had me committed here against my will, forged my signature on documents, and tried to steal my $3 million estate. She thought I was a helpless old woman with dementia. She was wrong about everything except my age. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Elizabeth Hayes, and at 74 years old, I thought I had lived through every possible betrayal life could throw at me. I buried my husband of 48 years, survived cancer twice, and rebuilt my finances from nothing after Harold's medical bills nearly bankrupted us. What I never imagined was that my own flesh and blood would be the one to deliver the cruelest blow of all. It started on a Tuesday morning in October when my daughter Jessica arrived at my Riverside Drive penthouse unannounced. I should have known something was wrong the moment I opened the door. Jessica never visited without calling first, and she certainly never showed up before noon on a weekday. She stood in my doorway wearing her expensive navy suit, the one she wore to important court cases, with her auburn hair pulled back in that severe bun that made her look older than her 42 years. "Good morning, Mother," she said, her voice carrying that professional tone she used with difficult clients. Behind her stood a man I didn't recognize, holding a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Jessica, darling, what a surprise," I said, stepping aside to let them in. "I wasn't expecting you. Is everything all right?" She walked past me into the living room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors Harold and I had installed during our second year of marriage. The stranger followed, his eyes scanning my home like he was taking inventory. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I pushed the feeling aside. Jessica was my daughter, after all, my only child. The little girl I had rocked to sleep, taught to ride a bicycle, and put through law school by working double shifts at the department store. "Mother, we need to talk," Jessica said, settling herself on my cream-colored sofa without invitation. "This is Dr. Richard Pemberton. He's a geriatric psychiatrist, and I've asked him to come here today because I'm concerned about you." The words hit me like a physical blow. I remained standing, my hands gripping the back of Harold's favorite chair for support. "Concerned about what, exactly?" Dr. Pemberton opened his briefcase and pulled out a yellow legal pad. "Mrs. Hayes, your daughter has expressed some worries about your mental capacity lately. She's mentioned incidents of confusion, memory lapses, and concerning behavior patterns." I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment. "Memory lapses? What are you talking about, Jessica? I'm as sharp as I've ever been." Jessica's expression remained cool and professional. "Mother, last week when I called, you forgot we had plans for lunch. The week before, you couldn't remember Mrs. Patterson's name, and you've lived next door to her for 20 years. You've been buying things you don't need, making impulsive financial decisions." Each accusation felt like a knife. Twist. The lunch plans she mentioned had been canceled by her at the last minute via text message while I was already dressed and waiting. Mrs. Patterson had recently remarried and taken her new husband's name, which I had momentarily forgotten in casual conversation. As for impulsive purchases, I had recently bought a new car to replace my 15-year-old sedan, and I had donated generously to several charities Harold and I had supported for decades. "These are perfectly normal things," I protested. "Everyone forgets things occasionally. That doesn't mean I'm losing my mind." Dr. Pemberton made notes on his pad. "Mrs. Hayes, I'd like to ask you a few questions if you don't mind. What year is it?" The condescending tone in his voice made my blood boil. "It's 2024, October 15th to be precise. Today is Tuesday. The president is Joe Biden, though I didn't vote for him. The weather is unseasonably warm for October, and I had oatmeal with blueberries for breakfast along with my morning coffee, which I've been drinking black since 1973. Jessica shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. Mother, there's no need to be hostile. We're only trying to help. Help? With what? I demanded. I live independently. I manage my own finances. I drive. I cook. I clean. I volunteer at the library twice a week and serve on the board of 3 different charities. What exactly do you think I need help with? Dr. Pemberton looked up from his notes. Mrs. Hayes, your daughter is concerned about your ability to continue living alone safely. She's mentioned that you've fallen recently. I stared at Jessica in disbelief. Fallen? When did I fall? Last month when you were bringing groceries? Upstairs, she said smoothly. You told me yourself you nearly fell on the steps. The distortion of truth was breathtaking. I had indeed mentioned struggling with heavy grocery bags, so I had started having my groceries delivered instead. This was not falling. This was problem solving. But somehow, in Jessica's retelling, my practical adaptation had become evidence of physical decline. I never fell, I said firmly. I told you I was having groceries delivered because the bags were getting heavy. That's called being sensible, not incompetent. Dr. Pemberton made more notes. Mrs. Hayes, confusion about recent events can be an early sign of cognitive decline. It's possible you don't remember the incident clearly. The gaslighting was so blatant it took my breath away. Here was a stranger suggesting I couldn't trust my own memory based on lies my daughter had told him. I looked at Jessica, searching, her face for some sign of the loving child I had raised, but all I saw was cold calculation. What exactly are you proposing? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew. Jessica reached into her purse and pulled out a thick manila folder. Mother, I think it would be best if you moved into a care facility where you can get the support you need. I've found a lovely place called Sunset Manor. It's very well regarded, and the staff is specially trained to work with people who are experiencing cognitive changes. My knees felt weak, and I sank into Harold's chair. You want to put me in a nursing home? It's an assisted living facility, she corrected, as if the euphemism made the betrayal less bitter. You'd have your own room, 3 meals a day, activities, and medical care right on site. No more worrying about grocery shopping, or housework or managing bills. I don't worry about any of those things now, I said quietly. I enjoy managing my own life. Dr. Pemberton leaned forward with practiced sympathy. Mrs. Hayes, I understand this is difficult to hear. Many people resist the idea of transitioning to care facilities. But the reality is that continuing to live alone when you're experiencing cognitive decline can be dangerous. What if you fell and couldn't get help? What if you forgot to turn off the stove? These are real risks we need to consider. I wanted to scream that I wasn't experiencing cognitive decline, that every example they had given was either fabricated or twisted beyond recognition. But I could see from their expressions that they had already made up their minds. This wasn't a discussion. It was an ambush. I want you both to leave, I said, standing up with as much dignity as I could muster. I am not moving anywhere, and I resent the implication that I'm not capable of making my own decisions. Jessica's mask of concern slipped slightly, revealing something harder underneath. Mother, I'm trying to do this the easy way, but if you won't listen to reason, there are other options. The threat was barely veiled. As a lawyer, Jessica knew exactly what legal mechanisms existed to remove an elderly person's autonomy. She was letting me know that voluntary cooperation would be preferable to the alternative. Are you threatening me, Jessica? I'm trying to protect you, she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. From yourself, if necessary. After they left, I sat in Harold's chair for hours, trying to process what had just happened. My daughter, the child I had sacrificed everything for, wanted to warehouse me in an institution and take control of my life. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't a sudden concern for my welfare. This was a calculated plan. I had been widowed for 3 years, and in that time, Jessica's visits had become increasingly infrequent. She rarely called, unless she needed something, and when she did visit, I often caught her looking around the apartment with an appraising eye. She had made comments about how much the place was worth, how property values in our neighborhood had skyrocketed, how it was too much space for one person. Harold and I had bought this penthouse in 1987 when Jessica was 5 years old. We had scrimped and saved for the down payment, working extra shifts and skipping vacations to afford the mortgage. Harold was a mechanical engineer, and I worked in retail management. We weren't wealthy, but we were determined to build something lasting for our family. The apartment had been our pride and joy. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. We had hosted Jessica's birthday parties here, celebrated holidays, entertained friends, and colleagues. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When Harold got sick, we had discussed selling to help pay for his treatment, but he had insisted we hold on to it. "This is Jessica's inheritance," he had said. "This is what we're leaving behind." After Harold's death, the apartment had become my sanctuary. Every room held memories of our life together. His reading chair by the window where he would sit with his morning newspaper. The kitchen where we had cooked thousands of meals together. The bedroom where we had talked late into the night about our dreams and fears. Jessica wanted to take all of that away from me and lock me in a sterile room with strangers. But there was more to it than sentimentality. The apartment was worth approximately $3 million in the current market. Add to that my retirement savings, Harold's life insurance, and various investments, and my total estate was worth nearly $3 million. As my only heir, Jessica stood to inherit everything when I died. But if I lived for another 10 or 15 years, as women in my family typically did, she would have to wait a long time for that inheritance. However, if I were declared incompetent and placed in a care facility, Jessica could potentially gain power of attorney over my finances. She could sell the apartment, liquidate my investments, and use the money to pay for my care while building her own wealth. It was a perfect plan, really, if you didn't mind destroying your mother's life in the process. I spent that evening going through my financial documents, making sure everything was in order. My will was up to date, my accounts were all in my name alone, and I had no outstanding debts. I was financially stable and mentally competent, despite what Jessica and her hired psychiatrist wanted to believe. The next morning, I called my attorney, Robert Chen, who had handled Harold's estate and various other legal matters for our family over the years. Robert had known Jessica since she was a child, had even written her a recommendation letter for law school. If anyone could help me understand what I was facing, it would be him. "Margaret, I have to say I'm surprised to hear from you about this," Robert said when I explained the situation. "Jessica came to see me last week asking about conservatorship proceedings. She said you were showing signs of dementia and that she was worried about your safety." My heart sank. Jessica had been planning this for at least a week, possibly longer. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that conservatorship is a serious legal matter that requires substantial evidence of incapacity. I also told her that if she were truly concerned about your welfare, she should encourage you to see your own doctor for an evaluation rather than bringing in someone you've never met." I felt a surge of gratitude for Robert's wisdom and integrity. "So what are my options if she tries to pursue this legally?" "Well, she would need to file a petition with the court and provide evidence that you're unable to make your own decisions. A judge would then order an independent evaluation by a court-appointed psychiatrist. The good news is that the burden of proof is quite high. She can't just claim you're incompetent. She has to prove it. But she's a lawyer, Robert. She knows how to build a case." "That's true, but you're not helpless here, Margaret. You have rights and you have resources to defend yourself. I'd recommend you get a comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation from your own doctors to establish a baseline of your mental capacity. Document everything she's said and done. And consider having someone you trust witness your daily activities to counter any claims about your ability to function independently. After hanging up with Robert, I felt somewhat better, but I was still deeply shaken by Jessica's betrayal. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about control and respect. Jessica saw me as an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I decided to take Robert's advice and made appointments with both my primary care physician and a neurologist for comprehensive evaluations. I also began keeping a detailed journal of my daily activities, noting everything, from my morning routine to my volunteer work to my social interactions. If Jessica wanted to claim I was incompetent, I would have evidence to the contrary. A week passed without any contact from Jessica, which was unusual. Normally, even with our strained relationship, she would call or text every few days. The silence felt ominous, like the calm before a storm. Then on the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after her first visit, she returned. This time she wasn't alone. With her were 2 paramedics, a police officer, and the same Dr. Pemberton from the week before. They had an ambulance waiting downstairs. "Mother, please don't make this difficult," Jessica said as I opened the door. "We're here to take you for an evaluation. It's for your own safety." I looked at the police officer, a young man who looked uncomfortable with the situation. "Officer, I haven't committed any crime. I'm not a danger to myself or anyone else. On what grounds are you here?" He shifted awkwardly. "Ma'am, we have a court order for an emergency psychiatric evaluation. Your daughter has filed paperwork, claiming you're a danger to yourself due to mental incapacity." I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. "A court order? When?" I was never notified of any court proceedings. Jessica stepped forward with a document in her hand. "Emergency evaluations can be ordered without prior notice when there's an immediate safety concern. Dr. Pemberton has provided a preliminary assessment supporting the need for immediate intervention." The betrayal was complete. Not only had Jessica lied about my mental state, but she had also manipulated the legal system to force me from my home. Dr. Pemberton, who had spent less than 30 minutes with me, had apparently provided enough pseudo-medical justification to convince a judge that I was an immediate danger to myself. "I want to call my attorney," I said. "You can call anyone you want once you've been evaluated," Jessica replied. "But right now, we need to go." The paramedics looked sympathetic but determined. The police officer kept checking his watch as if he had somewhere else to be. Dr. Pemberton maintained his professional demeanor, but I could see the smug satisfaction in his eyes. This was just another job to him, another elderly person to be processed through the system. "If I go voluntarily, where exactly are you taking me?" I asked. "To Riverside General for the psychiatric evaluation," Jessica said. "After that, depending on the results, you may need to stay at Sunset Manor temporarily while we sort everything out." Temporarily? The word was meaningless in this context. Once I was in the system, once Jessica had legal control, temporary could become permanent. Very quickly, I looked around my apartment one last time, taking in the photos of Harold and me, the books we had collected over the years, the furniture we had chosen together. I didn't know when or if I would see any of it again. "Can I pack a bag?" I asked. "Of course," Jessica said, her tone softening slightly. "Take whatever you need." I went to my bedroom and quickly packed a small suitcase with essentials, medications, a few changes of clothes, some personal items, and most importantly, my important documents and contact information for Robert Chen. I also grabbed my cell phone charger and made sure my phone was fully charged. As I packed, I could hear Jessica in the living room, already making plans. She was on her phone with someone, discussing real estate values and market timing. She wasn't even trying to hide her true motivations anymore. The ride to the hospital was humiliating. Sitting in the back of an ambulance while neighbors watched from their windows, I felt like a criminal being taken into custody. Jessica rode in her own car, following behind us like a funeral procession. At Riverside General, I was processed like any other psychiatric patient. My belongings were searched, my medications were confiscated pending review, and I was given a hospital gown to wear. The intake nurse was kind but efficient, asking standard questions about my mental state and medical history. "Mrs. Hayes, I need to ask you some questions for our assessment," she said. "Have you had any thoughts of hurting yourself or others?" "Absolutely not," I replied. "The only person I'm angry with is my daughter, and that's because she's trying to steal my life, not because I'm mentally ill." The nurse made notes without comment. "Have you been experiencing any confusion, memory problems, or disorientation?" "No more than anyone my age occasionally experiences. I know exactly where I am, why I'm here, and what day it is. I also know this entire situation is based on lies my daughter told to get control of my estate." More notes. "Have you been taking care of yourself at home? Eating regularly, maintaining hygiene, taking medications as prescribed?" "Yes, completely. I've been living independently for 3 years since my husband died. I manage my own finances, do my own shopping, maintain my home, and volunteer regularly in the community." The evaluation continued for over an hour, covering everything from my childhood to my current living situation. The nurse seemed increasingly puzzled as she realized there was nothing obviously wrong with me. I answered every question clearly and coherently, demonstrated perfect recall of recent and distant events, and showed no signs of confusion or delusion. "Mrs. Hayes, I have to say, you seem very lucid and oriented to me," the nurse said finally. "I'm not sure why you're here." "Neither am I," I replied. "But my daughter is a lawyer, and she's convinced someone that I'm incompetent so she can take control of my assets." Dr. Pemberton arrived for his formal evaluation an hour later. This time, his questions were more pointed and aggressive. He seemed determined to find evidence of mental decline, asking the same questions multiple times in slightly different ways, trying to catch me in a contradiction. "Mrs. Hayes, your daughter tells me you've been making impulsive purchases lately. Can you tell me about that?" "I bought a new car to replace my 15-year-old sedan, and I made some charitable donations to organizations my late husband and I have supported for years. Neither of these decisions was impulsive." "But you didn't consult with your daughter before making these financial decisions." "Why would I? I'm an adult with my own money. I don't need my daughter's permission to make purchases." He made notes with obvious disapproval. "Mrs. Hayes, at your age, it's often wise to involve family members in major financial decisions to ensure you're not being taken advantage of." The irony was staggering. Here was a doctor suggesting I needed protection from financial exploitation while participating in what was clearly an attempt to exploit me financially. The evaluation went on for another hour, but it was clear that Dr. Pemberton had already reached his conclusion before walking into the room. No matter how coherently I answered his questions, he continued to probe for signs of incapacity that simply weren't there. Finally, he closed his notebook and stood up. "Mrs. Hayes, based on my evaluation and the concerns raised by your daughter, I'm recommending that you be transferred to Sunset Manor for observation and further assessment. This will give us time to do a more comprehensive evaluation of your needs." "And if I refuse?" "Unfortunately, that's not an option at this point. The court order gives us the authority to place you in protective custody until a full competency hearing can be arranged." I felt trapped and powerless, exactly as Jessica had intended. Within 2 hours, I was being transported to Sunset Manor, a sprawling one-story building on the outskirts of town that looked more like a prison than a care facility. The intake process at Sunset Manor was even more dehumanizing than the hospital. My remaining personal belongings were inventoried and stored. I was given institutional clothing to wear, and I was assigned to a shared room with a woman named Dorothy, who spent most of her time talking to people who weren't there. "Welcome to Sunset Manor, Mrs. Hayes," said the intake coordinator, a heavy-set woman named Linda who spoke to me like I was a child. "We're going to take very good care of you here. Your daughter has already filled out all the paperwork and provided us with your medical information." "I want to make a phone call," I said. "Phone privileges are earned based on good behavior and adjustment to the facility," Linda replied. "For now, you need to focus on settling in and following our daily routine." Phone privileges had to be earned. I was a prisoner, not a patient. Jessica had succeeded in stripping away my freedom, my dignity, and my autonomy with a few forged documents and a corrupt psychiatrist. That first night at Sunset Manor, lying in a narrow bed listening to Dorothy mumble incoherently, I made a decision. I wasn't going to accept this. I wasn't going to be warehoused and forgotten while Jessica liquidated my life's work. I was going to fight back, and I was going to make her regret the day she decided to betray me. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against and figure out how to regain control of my life. The old Margaret might have been trusting and naive enough to fall for Jessica's manipulation, but the new Margaret was going to be smarter, tougher, and more ruthless than my daughter could possibly imagine. As I lay there planning my counterattack, I had no idea that within 6 months, I would own Sunset Manor outright, and Jessica would be facing criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud. The war was just beginning, and I had every intention of winning it. The first 3 days at Sunset Manor taught me more about institutional manipulation than I had learned in 74 years of life. Every aspect of daily existence was designed to strip away independence and dignity, from the scheduled bathroom breaks to the bland, overcooked meals served at precise intervals. The staff spoke to residents in sing-song voices typically reserved for toddlers, and any attempt to assert autonomy was met with gentle but firm redirection back to compliance. My roommate Dorothy had been there for 18 months, and her transformation from functioning adult to institutional dependent was a cautionary tale I refused to accept as my own future. According to her son Michael, who visited every Sunday, with obvious guilt written across his face, Dorothy had been a retired high school principal who managed her own affairs perfectly well until a minor car accident gave her family the excuse they needed to take control. "She just needs a little help," Michael would tell the staff during his visits, never speaking directly to his mother, who sat silently in her wheelchair, wearing the vacant expression of someone who had given up fighting. "The doctors say she's much safer here." I watched these interactions with growing rage, recognizing the same patterns of justified betrayal I had experienced with Jessica. Adult children convincing themselves that stealing their parents' autonomy was an act of love rather than greed or convenience. The staff at Sunset Manor were experts at enabling this self-deception, providing families with just enough medical-sounding justification to sleep peacefully while their parents deteriorated in institutional custody. On my 4th morning, during what the staff cheerfully called social hour, but was actually mandatory group sitting in the common room, I struck up a conversation with a woman named Eleanor Blackwood. Unlike most of the other residents, Eleanor's eyes were sharp and alert, and she carried herself with the bearing of someone who hadn't yet surrendered to the system. "You're new," she observed, settling into the chair beside me with the careful movements of someone managing chronic pain. "And you're angry. Good. Anger means you're still fighting." Eleanor was 81 years old and had been at Sunset Manor for 6 months. Her story was depressingly familiar. Successful career as a federal judge, comfortable retirement, adult children who grew impatient waiting for their inheritance. Unlike my situation, Eleanor's commitment had been triggered by a genuine health crisis, a mild stroke that left her temporarily confused and vulnerable. "My son David convinced me to sign a power of attorney while I was still in the hospital," she explained during one of our whispered conversations. "He said it was just temporary, to help manage things while I recovered. That was 8 months ago. I've been perfectly lucid for 6 months, but somehow I'm still here. Why haven't You challenged it legally, I asked. Eleanor laughed bitterly. With what money? David controls my finances now. He pays for this place, pays for my medications, and gives me $20 a week as an allowance. When I demanded to see my financial statements, he told the staff I was becoming agitated and paranoid. They increased my anti-anxiety medication. The systematic nature of the trap became clear to me as Eleanor described her situation. Once families gained legal control, they could manipulate every aspect of their parents' life to maintain that control. Financial independence was eliminated, outside contacts were monitored or restricted, and any signs of resistance were pathologized as symptoms requiring treatment. The worst part, Eleanor continued, is that David genuinely believes he's doing the right thing. He visits twice a month and talks about how much better I look, how well I'm being cared for, how much less stress I must feel now that I don't have to worry about managing my own life. He's convinced himself that trapping me here is an act of compassion. I shared my own story with Eleanor, and we began meeting regularly during meals and activities to strategize our escape from what we privately called the machine. Eleanor's legal background proved invaluable as she explained the various mechanisms that had been used to strip away our rights and the potential paths to reclaiming them. The key, she explained, is proving that the original determinations of incapacity were fraudulent or no longer valid. But that requires resources we don't currently have access to. We need outside legal representation, independent medical evaluations, and evidence of our current competency. What about family court? Can't we petition directly? Theoretically, yes. But the system is designed to favor the status quo. Judges are reluctant to overturn previous rulings without compelling evidence, and our families will fight any attempt to regain independence. They have too much to lose financially. Despite the challenges, Eleanor and I began documenting everything. We kept detailed journals of our daily activities, conversations with staff, and interactions with family members. We memorized phone numbers and addresses of potential allies. Most importantly, we began observing the operations of Sunset Manor itself, looking for vulnerabilities in the system that had trapped us. What we discovered was deeply disturbing. Sunset Manor was not just a care facility, it was a profit-driven machine that thrived on keeping residents dependent and families convinced of their necessity. The monthly fees were staggering, typically ranging from $8,000 to $15,000 depending on the level of care required. Most residents' estates were being systematically drained to pay these costs while their families convinced themselves that quality care justified the expense. The facility's medical director, Dr. Amanda Foster, played a crucial role in maintaining this system. She regularly diagnosed new conditions that required higher levels of care, prescribed medications that caused cognitive impairment or physical weakness, and provided families with medical justifications for continued institutionalization. Residents who showed signs of improvement or independence were quickly medicated back into compliance. "It's brilliant, really," Eleanor observed during one of our planning sessions. "They've created a system where resistance to the institution is treated as a symptom of the very condition that supposedly requires institutionalization. The more you fight, the more they justify keeping you here." My own experience with Dr. Foster confirmed Eleanor's analysis. During my weekly medical review, she noted in my chart that I was showing signs of adjustment disorder and oppositional behavior that indicated ongoing mental health concerns. When I pointed out that I was simply objecting to being held against my will, she prescribed a mild antidepressant to help with my emotional regulation. Mrs. Hayes, resistance to necessary care is often a sign that the underlying cognitive issues are more serious than initially apparent, she explained in her maddeningly patronizing tone. "These medications will help you feel more comfortable with your new living situation." I pretended to take the medications while actually storing them in a small hiding place Eleanor had shown me. Several other residents had taught us various tricks for avoiding unwanted medications, from cheek-hiding tablets to timing bathroom breaks to interrupt medication rounds. The staff was overworked and undertrained, making such deceptions relatively easy for residents who still possessed their faculties. 3 weeks into my imprisonment, Jessica made her first visit. She arrived during afternoon visiting hours wearing a black designer dress and carrying expensive flowers, playing the role of devoted daughter for the staff and other families present. Her performance was worthy of an Academy Award. "Mother, you look wonderful," she gushed, embracing me with theatrical warmth. "The staff tells me you're adjusting well to your new routine." I pulled away from her embrace and stared into her eyes, searching for any sign of genuine emotion. What I found was cold calculation mixed with practiced guilt. She had convinced herself that my situation was necessary and beneficial, just as Eleanor had predicted. "Jessica, I want to go home," I said simply. Her expression shifted to practiced concern. "Mother, we've talked about this. Home isn't safe for you anymore. Here you have medical supervision, social activities, and people who understand your needs. My needs are to live in my own home and manage my own life. I don't need supervision, and I certainly don't need to be locked up like a criminal." She glanced around nervously, aware that other families might be listening. "Mother, please don't make a scene. These people are trying to help you." "These people are keeping me prisoner while you liquidate my assets," I replied, my voice carrying enough to attract attention from nearby tables. Jessica's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the anger underneath. "You're being irrational, Mother. This is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking that proves you need professional care." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Jessica alternating between false sympathy and veiled threats. She informed me that she had listed my apartment for sale, claiming that the proceeds would help pay for my care. She had also taken control of my investment accounts and was reorganizing my finances to ensure my long-term security. "What about my will?" I asked. "What about my wishes for how my estate should be handled?" "Mother, you're not going to die anytime soon," she replied with forced cheerfulness. "We're just making sure everything is managed properly while you focus on your health and adjustment." Before leaving, Jessica met privately with Dr. Foster and the facility administrator. Through Eleanor's intelligence network among the staff, we learned that she had authorized additional security measures to prevent me from wandering, and had requested that my phone privileges remain suspended indefinitely due to my agitated state. That evening, I sat in the common room staring out at the parking lot where Jessica's Mercedes had been parked during her visit. The car was worth more than most people earned in a year, purchased with money from her law practice, but enhanced by the monthly allowances I had provided throughout her adult life. Now she was using my own assets to finance my imprisonment, while convincing herself she was protecting me. The injustice of it all crystallized into cold, clear determination. Jessica thought she was dealing with a helpless old woman who would eventually accept her fate and fade quietly into institutional obscurity. She had no idea that she had awakened something far more dangerous than the compliant mother she remembered. Over the following weeks, Eleanor and I refined our understanding of Sunset Manor's vulnerabilities and began developing a plan that went far beyond simple escape. We realized that fighting our individual cases through the legal system would be a lengthy process with uncertain outcomes. But what if we could attack the entire system that enabled our imprisonment? Our breakthrough came when Eleanor noticed inconsistencies in the facility's financial documentation. As a former federal judge, she had developed an eye for institutional corruption, and Sunset Manor's books told a story of systematic fraud that went far beyond overcharging families for care. "Margaret, look at these medication records," she whispered during one of our planning sessions. "They're billing Medicare and private insurance for medications that residents aren't actually receiving. And the staffing ratios they report to, state regulators don't match the actual staffing levels." We began documenting everything systematically, Eleanor's legal training helped us identify which violations would be most damaging to the facility's operations, while my business experience from years of retail management helped me understand the financial implications of what we were uncovering. The medication fraud was particularly extensive. Residents were prescribed expensive drugs that were often unnecessary or even harmful, but the facility billed insurance companies for the full cost, while frequently providing generic substitutes, or smaller doses than prescribed. The difference went directly into the facility's profits. Staffing fraud was equally pervasive. Sunset Manor reported to state regulators that they maintained specific ratios of nurses to patients and provided various specialized services. In reality, they operated with minimal staffing and contracted out most medical services to the lowest bidders. The quality of care suffered dramatically, but the profits remained high. "This isn't just neglect," Eleanor observed. "This is systematic theft from Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance companies. The federal government takes fraud like this very seriously." We also discovered that Dr. Foster was prescribing medications to residents and then selling the unused portions to black market distributors. Many residents were either not taking their prescribed medications or were taking smaller doses than prescribed, creating a steady supply of valuable pharmaceuticals that Dr. Foster converted to personal profit. The more we investigated, the more we realized that Sunset Manor was essentially a criminal enterprise disguised as a healthcare facility. They were stealing from the government, from insurance companies, from families, and from the residents themselves. The systematic nature of the fraud suggested that this was not an isolated problem, but part of a larger pattern in the elder care industry. "Margaret, this is bigger than just getting ourselves out of here," Eleanor said during one of our late-night conversations. "This is about exposing a system that's destroying thousands of lives for profit." As we gathered evidence, we also began building relationships with sympathetic staff members who were disturbed by what they witnessed but felt powerless to change anything. Maria Santos, a night shift nursing assistant, became a valuable ally after she discovered that her own grandmother had been over-medicated at a similar facility in another state. "I see what they do to people here," Maria confided during one of our conversations. "Good people who just need a little help, but they get drugged and warehoused until they forget who they used to be. It's not right." Maria began providing us with access to facility records, medication logs, and financial documents that we would never have been able to obtain on our own. She also helped us establish communication with the outside world by allowing us to use her personal phone during her night shifts. My first call was to Robert Chen, my attorney, who had been trying to locate me for weeks. Jessica had told him that I was receiving specialized medical treatment and was not allowed visitors or phone calls, but she had refused to provide specific information about my location or condition. "Margaret, thank God," Robert said when he heard my voice. "I've been trying to find you for over a month. Jessica claims you're in a secure psychiatric facility, but she won't tell me which one or provide any medical documentation." I quickly explained my situation and the evidence Eleanor and I had been gathering about Sunset Manor's operations. Robert listened with growing amazement and alarm. "Margaret, what you're describing sounds like a massive criminal conspiracy. If you can document even half of what you're telling me, this could bring down not just Sunset Manor, but potentially dozens of similar facilities." "Robert, I need you to do something for me," I said. "I need you to contact the FBI's healthcare fraud division and arrange for them to investigate this place. But I need you to do it in a way that doesn't alert Jessica or the facility administration that I'm involved." "What do you have in mind?" "I want to stay here long enough to gather enough evidence to destroy them completely. But I need to know that help is coming and that you're working on getting me out legally." Robert agreed to begin the process while maintaining absolute secrecy about my involvement. He would file a motion challenging my commitment based on procedural violations and demand an independent competency evaluation. Meanwhile, he would also contact federal investigators about the fraud evidence we were developing. Over the next month, Eleanor and I worked tirelessly to document every aspect of Sunset Manor's criminal operations. We photographed documents, recorded conversations, and created detailed timelines of fraudulent activities. We also began identifying other residents who had been wrongfully committed and gathering their stories as evidence of the facility's systematic abuse. The most heartbreaking case was that of Robert Kim, a retired engineer whose daughter had committed him after he objected to her gambling addiction and refused to give her access to his retirement savings. Robert was completely lucid and capable, but he had been at Sunset Manor for over 2 years while his daughter systematically drained his accounts to fund her casino habits. "She visits every month and cries about how much she misses having me at home," Robert told us. "But she's sold my house, liquidated my investments, and taken out loans against my life insurance. She needs me to stay here until I die so she doesn't have to face what she's done." Eleanor and I realized that Robert's case, combined with our own situations and several others we had identified, represented a pattern of elder abuse that went far beyond simple institutional fraud. Families were using facilities like Sunset Manor to warehouse inconvenient parents while systematically looting their estates. "This is a business model," Eleanor observed. "These facilities provide families with medical and legal cover for financial exploitation while generating massive profits from government and insurance fraud. It's brilliant in its evil simplicity." As our investigation deepened, we also began to understand why the legal system was so ineffective at protecting elderly victims. Judges, lawyers, and social workers were overwhelmed with cases and often relied on the representations of family members and medical professionals without conducting independent investigations. The presumption was that families acted in their loved ones' best interests and that medical professionals were objective advocates for their patients. "The system assumes good faith on everyone's part," Eleanor explained. "But when families and medical professionals are both motivated by profit, elderly victims have no one to advocate for their actual interests." Dr. Foster's role was particularly crucial to the entire operation. As a licensed physician, her medical opinions carried significant weight with courts, insurance companies, and regulatory agencies. When she diagnosed residents with conditions requiring long-term institutional care, her professional credibility made it nearly impossible for anyone to challenge those determinations. We discovered that Dr. Foster had financial relationships with pharmaceutical companies, medical equipment suppliers, and other healthcare providers that created massive conflicts of interest. She received payments for prescribing specific medications, kickbacks for ordering unnecessary medical equipment, and bonuses based on the facility's profitability. "She's not a doctor," Eleanor said after reviewing the evidence we had gathered. "She's a sales representative for the medical industrial complex, and elderly patients are her product." The more we learned, the more determined we became to expose the entire system. This wasn't just about regaining our own freedom. It was about saving other families from the devastating betrayal we had experienced and preventing other elderly people from disappearing into institutional custody. 6 weeks into our investigation, Robert Chen called with news that would change everything. The FBI had opened a formal investigation into Sunset Manor based on the evidence we had provided, and federal agents were preparing to execute search warrants at the facility and several related businesses. "Margaret, they want you to continue gathering evidence if you're willing, but they understand the personal risk you're taking," Robert explained. "They're also preparing to move forward with your legal case to regain your freedom, but they're asking if you'd be willing to stay a little longer to help with the criminal investigation." I looked around the common room where I had spent the last 6 weeks planning my revenge against Jessica and the system that had enabled her betrayal. Elderly residents sat in wheelchairs and recliners, many of them drugged into compliance, all of them trapped in a web of institutional control that served everyone's interests except their own. "Tell them I'll stay as long as they need me," I said. "But I want Jessica arrested the moment they have enough evidence. She's going to pay for every day she's stolen from my life." Eleanor squeezed my hand as I hung up the phone. Are you ready for this, Margaret? Once we pull this trigger, there's no going back. I thought about Harold, about the life we had built together, about the apartment overlooking the river where I should have been living out my golden years in peace and dignity. I thought about Jessica, probably at that very moment showing my apartment to potential buyers while telling them stories about her poor mother who was safely tucked away in professional care. I've been ready since the day she had me dragged. Out of my own home, I replied. It's time to show Jessica and everyone like her that they picked the wrong mother to betray. The war was about to begin in earnest, and I had every intention of emerging victorious. The FBI raid on Sunset Manor happened on a Wednesday morning at exactly 7:30, just as the breakfast shift was beginning. I was sitting in the dining hall with Eleanor, pretending to struggle with my oatmeal while actually observing the daily medication distribution that we had been documenting for weeks. The first sign that something was happening came when Linda, the intake coordinator, rushed past our table with her face flushed and her hands shaking. Within minutes, federal agents were swarming through the facility, carrying boxes of documents and computer equipment while residents and staff watched in stunned silence. Dr. Foster was escorted out in handcuffs, her face a mask of rage and disbelief. The facility administrator, a slick man named Gregory Tillman, who had always treated residents like inventory, was also arrested on charges of healthcare fraud and conspiracy. Eleanor and I exchanged glances across the breakfast table, both of us fighting to keep our expressions neutral. After 2 months of careful planning and evidence gathering, our strategy was finally bearing fruit. But this was only the beginning of what we hoped would be a complete dismantling of the system that had trapped us. The chaos that followed the raid created opportunities we had been waiting for. With the administrative staff either arrested or fleeing, security protocols broke down completely. For the first time since arriving at Sunset Manor, residents had unsupervised access to phones, computers, and the outside world. Eleanor and I immediately began contacting family members, attorneys, and advocacy organizations to alert them about what had been happening. My first call was to my bank, where I discovered the full extent of Jessica's financial manipulation. In the 2 months since my commitment, she had liquidated nearly $800,000 of my investment portfolio, claiming the money was needed for my medical care. She had also received 2 offers on my apartment and was negotiating with buyers despite my explicit instructions that the property was not for sale. Mrs. Hayes, I'm so glad to hear from you, said Patricia Wells, the bank manager who had handled my accounts for over 15 years. Your daughter told us you were receiving specialized treatment and couldn't be reached for financial consultations. We were concerned about some of the transactions she was requesting. What kind of transactions? I asked, though I already suspected the answer would infuriate me. She's been transferring large amounts from your investment accounts into her personal accounts, claiming they were loans for your medical expenses. She's also applied for a reverse mortgage on your apartment using a power of attorney document. The reverse mortgage was a particularly clever move. Jessica could access the equity in my apartment immediately while technically keeping the property in my name until my death. It was a way of inheriting her inheritance early while maintaining the legal fiction that she was acting in my best interests. Patricia, I need you to freeze all my accounts immediately, I said. Jessica does not have legitimate power of attorney, and any documents she's provided were obtained through fraud. I also need a complete accounting of every transaction she's authorized since October. Mrs. Hayes, I'll need you to come in personally to make these changes. Bank regulations require identity verification for major account modifications. This was the challenge I had been anticipating. As long as I remained at Sunset Manor, Jessica could claim that I was too impaired to make financial decisions. But if I could demonstrate my competency to bank officials and other business partners, it would undermine the legal foundation of her power of attorney. Patricia, I'm going to arrange for legal representation to contact you within 24 hours. I'm also going to request that you document Jessica's reaction when you inform her that the accounts have been frozen. I suspect her response will be very telling. Eleanor had been making similar calls to her own financial institutions and was discovering equally disturbing patterns of exploitation. Her son David had been even more aggressive than Jessica, liquidating her entire stock portfolio and using the proceeds to purchase rental properties in his own name. The beautiful thing about their greed, Eleanor observed, is that it's created a clear paper trail of criminal activity. They've been so confident in their control that they haven't bothered to hide what they're doing. That afternoon, Robert Chen arrived at Sunset Manor with a team of independent medical experts and court officials. The FBI investigation had provided him with leverage to demand immediate access to me for competency evaluation, and the facility's compromised legal position made it impossible for them to refuse. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a geriatric psychiatrist with impeccable credentials, spent 3 hours conducting a comprehensive evaluation of my mental state. Unlike Dr. Pemberton's cursory and biased assessment, Dr. Martinez's examination was thorough, objective, and designed to actually determine my cognitive abilities rather than find excuses for my imprisonment. Mrs. Hayes, based on my evaluation, you show no signs of cognitive impairment, dementia, or any other condition that would justify involuntary commitment, Dr. Martinez announced. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning abilities are intact, and you demonstrate clear understanding of your financial and legal circumstances. The court-appointed social worker Jennifer Walsh was equally impressed by my competency and deeply disturbed by the conditions at Sunset Manor. She had been investigating elder abuse cases for 12 years and recognized the institutional manipulation immediately. Mrs. Hayes, what happened to you appears to be part of a systematic pattern of exploitation, she explained. The facility and your daughter worked together to create a legal framework for controlling your assets while providing just enough medical justification to avoid scrutiny. Within 48 hours of the FBI raid, I was released from Sunset Manor and restored to full legal competency. Robert had arranged for temporary housing at a secure apartment complex while we sorted out the legal battles ahead. But leaving the facility was only the first step in what would be a comprehensive campaign to reclaim my life and ensure that Jessica faced consequences for her betrayal. The first order of business was regaining control of my finances. Jessica had been so confident in her legal position that she had made little effort to hide her theft. Bank records showed a clear pattern of unauthorized transfers, fraudulent loan applications, and asset liquidation that would be easily prosecuted as elder abuse and embezzlement. Jessica made a crucial mistake, Robert explained as we reviewed the financial documentation. She assumed that your incapacitation would be permanent and that no one would ever audit her decisions. She's left us with overwhelming evidence of criminal activity. The confrontation with Jessica came sooner than expected. 3 days after my release, she arrived at Robert's office demanding to know why her access to my accounts had been terminated. She still believed that I was safely locked away at Sunset Manor and that my attorney was acting without proper authorization. Mr. Chen, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but my mother is incapacitated, and I have legal guardianship over her affairs, Jessica announced as she stormed into the conference room where Robert and I were meeting. The look on her face when she saw me sitting at the conference table was worth every day of suffering I had endured at Sunset Manor. Her carefully constructed world collapsed in an instant as she realized that her victim had escaped and was now in a position to expose her crimes. "Hello, Jessica," I said calmly. "We need to talk." For a moment, she seemed frozen in disbelief. Then her lawyer training kicked in, and she began calculating damage control strategies. But it was already too late. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and she had no defense for actions that constituted clear criminal behavior. "Mother, I can explain everything," she began, but I cut her off. "Jessica, you forged documents to have me committed against my will. You liquidated my assets without authorization. You attempted to sell my home while I was imprisoned. You systematically stole nearly $1 million from my accounts while claiming it was for my benefit. There's nothing to explain except how you're going to make restitution before you go to prison." The meeting lasted over an hour, with Jessica alternating between denial, justification, and desperate attempts at emotional manipulation. She claimed that she had genuinely believed I was becoming incompetent, that Dr. Pemberton had convinced her that institutionalization was necessary, that every financial decision had been made with my best interests in mind. "Mother, I was trying to protect you," she insisted. "You were making impulsive decisions, forgetting important things. I was scared that someone would take advantage of you." "So you decided to take advantage of me first?" I replied. "Jessica, you stole my freedom, my dignity, and my money. You warehoused me in an institution where I was drugged and treated like a criminal. And you did it all while convincing yourself that you were saving me." Robert presented Jessica with a detailed accounting of her unauthorized transactions and informed her that criminal charges would be filed within the week unless she agreed to immediate full restitution and cooperation with ongoing investigations. "Jessica, you have 48 hours to return every penny you've stolen and to provide complete documentation of all transactions you've authorized," Robert stated. "You also need to cancel the sale of your mother's apartment and withdraw all applications for reverse mortgages or other financial instruments." "And if I refuse?" Jessica asked, though her voice lacked conviction. "Then you'll be arrested on charges of elder abuse, embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. The FBI is already investigating your relationship with Dr. Pemberton in Sunset Manor. Your cooperation now might result in reduced charges, but that window is closing rapidly." Jessica left the meeting shaken and defeated, finally understanding that her carefully planned exploitation had turned into a legal nightmare that could destroy her career and her freedom. But I wasn't finished with her yet. Financial restitution was only the beginning of the price she would pay for her betrayal. Over the following weeks, I worked with federal investigators to build comprehensive cases against everyone involved in the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed my life. Dr. Pemberton had already been arrested on charges related to his fraudulent psychiatric evaluations and his financial relationships with several elder care facilities. His practice was under investigation, and dozens of families were coming forward with similar stories of wrongful commitment. The investigation into Sunset Manor had revealed a vast network of corruption that extended far beyond a single facility. The company that owned Sunset Manor operated over 40 similar institutions across 6 states, all using the same model of systematic fraud and family manipulation. Federal prosecutors were treating it as a racketeering case with potential damages in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Eleanor had also been released and was working with authorities as a key witness in the federal case. Her legal expertise and insider knowledge of the facility's operations made her invaluable to prosecutors building their case against the entire elder care network. "Margaret, this is bigger than we ever imagined," Eleanor told me during one of our strategy meetings. "The FBI has identified a pattern of elder abuse that affects thousands of families nationwide. Our case could be the catalyst for reforming the entire system." But my personal focus remained on Jessica and the specific harm she had caused to my life. Financial restitution wasn't enough. I wanted her to understand the full consequences of treating her mother like a commodity to be managed and exploited. The opportunity for perfect justice came when I learned that Sunset Manor was being forced into bankruptcy by the federal investigation and the civil lawsuits that followed. The facility would be sold at auction to satisfy creditors, and I realized that I had the perfect way to ensure that Jessica never forgot the lesson I was about to teach her. Using the money that Jessica had been forced to return, plus my own savings and a portion of Harold's life insurance that I had never touched, I submitted a bid to purchase Sunset Manor outright. The irony was too perfect to resist. The facility that had been used to imprison me would become my property, and I would transform it into something that actually served the needs of elderly people rather than exploiting them. The bid process was complicated by the ongoing federal investigation, But Robert was able to navigate the legal requirements with help from prosecutors who saw the symbolic value of having a former victim take control of the institution that had abused her. "Margaret, are you sure about this?" Robert asked. Buying and operating a care facility is an enormous undertaking, especially one with Sunset Manor's history of problems. "Robert, I've spent the last 3 months learning everything there. Is to know about how these places operate," I replied. "I know exactly what needs to be changed, and I have the resources and motivation to do it right." The purchase was finalized 6 weeks later, making me the owner of the facility where I had been held prisoner just 3 months earlier. The transformation began immediately, starting with the firing of every administrator and medical professional who had participated in the previous regime's abuses. Linda, the intake coordinator who had spoken to me like a child and denied me basic rights, cleaned out her desk under the supervision of security guards. The nursing staff who had ignored residents' complaints and participated in medication fraud were terminated and reported to state licensing boards. Dr. Foster's replacement was a respected geriatrician with a track record of patient advocacy rather than institutional profit. "Mrs. Hayes, I have to say, this is the most unusual takeover I've ever been involved in," said the court-appointed monitor overseeing the transition. "But your plans for reforming the facility's operations are exactly what the residents need. The changes I implemented were based on everything Eleanor and I had learned about institutional abuse during our time as prisoners. Residents regained control over their daily schedules, their medication decisions, and their contact with the outside world. Family members were required to provide financial transparency and submit to regular audits to prevent exploitation. Most importantly, residents were treated as autonomous adults rather than problems to be managed. Eleanor joined me as the facility's patient advocate, using her legal background to ensure that residents' rights were protected and that families couldn't manipulate the system for their own benefit. Together, we created policies that made it nearly impossible for adult children to warehouse inconvenient parents while looting their estates. "Margaret, what we're doing here could become a model for elder care nationwide," Eleanor observed. "We're proving that it's possible to provide quality care while respecting residents' autonomy and dignity." The most satisfying moment came when Jessica was forced to visit the facility she had used to imprison me, but now as a defendant in a criminal case, rather than as a manipulative daughter controlling her mother's fate. She arrived with her own attorney for a deposition related to the federal investigation, clearly uncomfortable with the role reversal that had occurred. "Hello, Jessica," I said as she entered my office, the same room where Dr. Foster had once plotted to keep me medicated and compliant. "Welcome to my nursing home." The meeting was brief and professional, focused on her cooperation with ongoing investigations. But the symbolism was unmistakable. The woman who had tried to bury me in an institution was now sitting across from me in that same institution, which I now owned and operated according to principles that would have prevented her crimes. "Mother, I want you to know that I never intended for things to go this far," Jessica said as the deposition concluded. "I genuinely thought I was helping you." "Jessica, the road to hell is paved with good intentions," I replied. "But theft is theft, regardless of how you justify it to yourself. You didn't want to help me? You wanted to control me. There's a difference." As Jessica left the facility that day, I watched from my office window as she walked past residents who were enjoying freedoms that had been denied to me during my imprisonment. They were gardening in raised beds I had installed, reading in a library I had created, and visiting with family members in comfortable spaces designed for genuine connection rather than institutional efficiency. The transformation of Sunset Manor became a symbol of resistance against elder abuse that attracted national attention. Media outlets covered the story of the elderly woman who had turned the tables on the system that tried to destroy her, and advocacy organizations began using our model as a blueprint for reform. "Mrs. Hayes, what you've accomplished here is remarkable," said Senator Patricia Morrison, who visited the facility as part of a congressional investigation into elder abuse. You've taken a facility that represented everything wrong with elder care and turned it into an example of how things should be done. But the most meaningful recognition came from residents and their families who were experiencing genuine care for the first time. Robert Kim, the retired engineer whose daughter had committed him to fund her gambling addiction, was able to regain control of his remaining assets and choose his own living arrangements. Dorothy, my former roommate who had been drugged into submission, regained her mental clarity and reconnected with friends from her former life as a high school principal. "Mrs. Hayes, I don't know how to thank you," Dorothy said during one of our regular check-ins. "You gave me my life back when I thought it was over forever." The criminal prosecutions that resulted from our investigation sent shockwaves through the elder care industry. Dr. Pemberton was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for his role in fraudulent commitments and Medicare fraud. Dr. Foster received 12 years for her more extensive criminal enterprise. Gregory Tillman, the facility administrator, was sentenced to 15 years and ordered to pay millions in restitution. Jessica ultimately pled guilty to elder abuse and embezzlement, charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 3 years in federal prison. Her law license was permanently revoked, and she was ordered to pay full restitution plus punitive damages that would keep her financially struggling for the rest of her life. "Margaret, Jessica's sentencing hearing is next week," Robert informed me. "The prosecutor would like you to provide a victim impact statement if you're interested." I considered the offer carefully. Part of me wanted to face Jessica in court and describe the full impact of her betrayal, to make her understand the depth of pain she had caused. But another part of me realized that my revenge was already complete. She had lost her freedom, her career, her financial security, and her relationship with her mother. Most importantly, she had to live with the knowledge that her greed had transformed her victim into the owner of the very institution she had used for her crimes. "Robert, I think my statement has already been made," I replied. "Sunset Manor is my victim impact statement. Every day that it operates as a place of dignity and respect rather than exploitation and abuse is a reminder of what Jessica tried to take from me and what I built from the ashes of her betrayal." The new Sunset Manor became profitable within its first year under my ownership, proving that elder care could be both ethical and financially sustainable. We achieved this not through fraud and exploitation, but through genuine efficiency, transparent pricing, and quality care that families were willing to pay for without being manipulated into it. Eleanor and I often reflected on the journey that had brought us from victims to advocates to successful business owners. Our transformation had been painful but ultimately empowering, proving that even the most devastating betrayals could be overcome with determination, intelligence, and strategic thinking. "Margaret, do you ever regret fighting back instead of just accepting what happened to you?" Eleanor asked during one of our evening walks through the facility's gardens. "Never," I replied without hesitation. "Jessica and people like her count on their victims being too tired, too confused, or too intimidated to fight back. They assume that once they gain control, they'll never have to face consequences for their actions. Our job is to prove them wrong and to make sure other families don't suffer what we went through." The legal and personal victories were satisfying, but the real reward was the knowledge that we had created something positive from our suffering. Sunset Manor under our management became a place where elderly people retained their dignity, their autonomy, and their rights while receiving the care and support they actually needed. 6 months after taking control of the facility, I stood in the same common room where I had spent weeks planning my escape and revenge, but now it was filled with residents who were there by choice, engaging in activities they enjoyed, maintaining relationships with family members who respected their independence, and living with the security that comes from being valued as human beings rather than managed as problems. The transformation was complete, but the work was just beginning. Eleanor and I had proven that the system could be changed, that elder abuse could be prevented, and that institutions could serve the people they claimed to help. Now we had to ensure that our model spread to other facilities and that other families never experienced the betrayal we had survived. Jessica's attempt to bury me in an institution had instead given me a platform to fight for justice and reform. Her greed had become the foundation for an enterprise dedicated to protecting the very people she had tried to exploit. The irony was perfect, and the justice was complete. I had not only survived my daughter's betrayal, I had transformed it into a victory that would protect other families for generations to come. The war was won, but the mission would continue, as long as elderly people needed advocates willing to fight for their rights and dignity. 2 years have passed since I first walked through the doors of Sunset Manor as Margaret Hayes, prisoner number 4847. Today, I walk these same halls as Margaret Hayes, owner and operator of one of the most respected elder care facilities in the state. The transformation has been so complete that sometimes I have to remind myself that this is the same building where I was once drugged, silenced, and treated like inventory. The morning sun streams through the windows of my office, the same room where Dr. Foster once prescribed medications to keep me compliant and confused. Now it's filled with awards from advocacy organizations, letters from grateful families, and photographs of residents celebrating milestones they never thought they'd see again. The irony isn't lost on me that the space designed to maintain my imprisonment has become the command center for my liberation. Eleanor knocked on my doorframe, carrying her usual stack of case files and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had just solved another family's crisis. At 83, she moved with the confidence of a woman who had found her true calling after decades of judicial service. Her transformation from broken victim to fierce advocate had been as dramatic as my own. "Margaret, we've got another victory," she announced, settling into the chair across from my desk. "The Patterson family case is resolved. David Patterson has agreed to return his mother's assets and will be moving her back to independent living, with appropriate support services." The Patterson case had been particularly egregious. David had committed his 79-year-old mother to a facility across town after she questioned his management of her finances. Unlike my situation, Mrs. Patterson had genuine mobility issues that required assistance, but she was mentally sharp and perfectly capable of making her own decisions with proper support. "How did you convince him to cooperate?" I asked, though I suspected Eleanor had used her favorite combination of legal pressure and public embarrassment. I simply explained that his mother's case fit the pattern we've documented in our elder abuse report, and that federal investigators were very interested in expanding their prosecution targets, Eleanor replied with a slight smile. Amazing how quickly people develop consciences when they face potential prison time. Our elder abuse report had become a powerful tool for protecting vulnerable seniors across the region. The comprehensive documentation we had developed during our time as prisoners, combined with the evidence gathered during the federal investigation, had exposed systematic patterns of exploitation that law enforcement couldn't ignore. The report had also established Eleanor and me as recognized experts in elder care fraud, leading to consulting opportunities with prosecutors, advocacy organizations, and legislative committees working on reform. We had testified before Congress, twice, been featured in documentary films, and spoken at conferences nationwide about the epidemic of family-perpetrated elder abuse. Speaking of federal investigations, Eleanor continued, I received a call from Special Agent Martinez this morning. The Milwaukee nursing home case is going to trial next month, and they want us to testify about the institutional patterns we identified. The Milwaukee case was part of a growing wave of prosecutions that had followed our initial investigation. Federal authorities had discovered that the corruption at Sunset Manor was just one node in a vast network of fraudulent elder care operations spanning multiple states. Our experience had provided the blueprint for understanding how these operations functioned and how families were manipulated into participating. Of course we'll testify, I replied. Every conviction makes it harder for other predators to target vulnerable seniors. The personal satisfaction of seeing criminals prosecuted was important, but the real impact came from the systematic changes we had implemented at Sunset Manor and advocated for throughout the industry. Our facility had become a laboratory for developing best practices in elder care, with innovations that prioritized resident autonomy while ensuring appropriate support and safety. One of our most successful programs was the Family Financial Transparency Initiative, which required adult children who controlled their parents' finances to submit to regular audits and accountability measures. The program had prevented dozens of exploitation cases and had been adopted by facilities across 3 states. Margaret, the state licensing board wants to expand the transparency program statewide, Eleanor informed me. They're proposing legislation that would make financial audits mandatory for all family-controlled elder care arrangements. This was the kind of systematic change that would have prevented my own exploitation and protected thousands of other seniors from similar betrayals. The legislation faced opposition from some family advocacy groups who claimed it was intrusive and presumptuous, but the documented evidence of widespread abuse made their arguments increasingly difficult to defend. My phone buzzed with a text message from Robert Chen, who continued to serve as my attorney despite his busy practice. The message was brief, but significant. Jessica's parole hearing scheduled for next month. Victim notification required. Your input requested. Jessica had served 18 months of her 3-year sentence and was eligible for early release based on good behavior and completion of court-mandated counseling programs. The prospect of her freedom stirred complicated emotions that I hadn't fully resolved despite all the victories and transformations of the past 2 years. Eleanor, Jessica's parole hearing is coming up, I said, showing her Robert's message. I'm not sure how I feel about weighing in on her release. Eleanor studied my expression with the insight that came from shared trauma and mutual understanding. Margaret, what would serve your sense of justice better? Keeping her in prison longer, or having her live in a world where you've made it impossible for her to hurt other people the way she hurt you? The question crystallized something I had been wrestling with since Jessica's conviction. My initial desire for revenge had been satisfied by her prosecution and imprisonment, but maintaining that anger served no constructive purpose. The real victory lay in the positive changes that had emerged from my suffering, not in prolonging her punishment. I think I want her to see what I've built with her attempt to destroy me, I said finally. I want her to understand that her betrayal became the foundation for protecting other families from what she did to us. That afternoon, I spent time with residents whose stories reminded me why the work we were doing mattered more than personal vendetants. Mrs. Chen, an 85-year-old former teacher, had been rescued from a facility where her son was stealing her pension checks. Now, she tutored children from the local elementary school and had regained the sense of purpose that institutionalization had nearly destroyed. Mrs. Hayes, my granddaughter is graduating from high school next week, Mrs. Chen told me during our daily check-in. She wrote her valedictorian speech about how you saved our family. Would you like to attend the ceremony? These invitations had become regular occurrences as word spread about the transformation at Sunset Manor and the advocacy work Eleanor and I had developed. Families who had been touched by elder abuse saw us as symbols of hope and resistance, proof that victims could become victors with enough determination and support. I would be honored to attend, I replied. And please tell your granddaughter that she's the one who should be proud. It takes courage to stand up for family members who can't protect themselves. That evening, I walked through the facility's common areas during the dinner hour, observing the atmosphere of dignity and choice that had replaced the institutional oppression I remembered so clearly. Residents moved freely, engaged in conversations about topics that interested them, and maintained relationships with family members who respected their autonomy. The contrast with my memories of this same space 2 years earlier was staggering. Instead of drugged compliance, there was vibrant engagement. Instead of forced schedules, there were flexible routines that accommodated individual preferences. Instead of financial exploitation, there were transparent policies that protected residents' assets while ensuring appropriate care. Dorothy, my former roommate who had seemed lost and confused mumbling, now served as the facility's resident council president and advocated for policy changes that improved daily life for everyone. Her transformation from institutional victim to empowered advocate embodied everything we had accomplished. Margaret, the council wants to propose a new program for residents who want to mentor young people aging out of foster care, Dorothy informed me during dinner. We think our life experiences could help kids who are facing independence without family support. The proposal was brilliant in its simplicity and generosity. Residents who had been discarded by their own families could provide guidance and wisdom to young people who lacked family connections entirely. It was exactly the kind of innovation that emerged when elderly people were treated as resources rather than burdens. Dorothy, that's an excellent idea. Let's develop a formal proposal and present it to the board next month. The Board of Directors. I had assembled for Sunset Manor reflected my commitment to genuine resident advocacy rather than financial exploitation. Instead of business executives focused on profit margins, the board included retired social workers, elder law attorneys, geriatricians, and most importantly, former residents who understood the difference between authentic care and institutional control. 3 weeks later, I found myself sitting in a courthouse waiting room, preparing to provide input on Jessica's parole hearing. Robert had helped me prepare a statement that focused on the broader impact of her crimes rather than personal grievances. But I still felt nervous about facing my daughter in an official capacity after 2 years of separation. Jessica entered the hearing room wearing an orange jumpsuit and accompanied by her court-appointed attorney. She had aged visibly during her incarceration, with gray streaks in her auburn hair and lines around her eyes that spoke to stress and regret. When she saw me sitting in the gallery, her expression flickered between surprise and something that might have been shame. The hearing proceeded with testimony from various officials about Jessica's behavior during incarceration, her participation in counseling programs, and her plans for reintegration into society. Her attorney emphasized her professional background, her lack of previous criminal history, and her expressed remorse for her actions. Your Honor, my client recognizes the serious harm caused by her actions and has used her time in custody to develop a deeper understanding of elder abuse issues, the attorney argued. She has completed extensive counseling and is committed to making amends for the damage she caused. When the judge invited victim impact statements, I stood and approached the podium with a folder containing the speech I had prepared. But looking at Jessica, seeing the broken woman she had become, I decided to speak from the heart instead of reading from prepared remarks. Your Honor, Jessica is my daughter, and despite everything that happened between us, I want her to have the opportunity to rebuild her life, I began. But I also want the court to understand that elder abuse isn't just a crime against individual victims. It's an attack on the fundamental trust that holds families and communities together. I described the transformation of Sunset Manor, the legislation that had emerged from our advocacy work, and the dozens of families who had been protected by the systems we had developed. I explained how Jessica's betrayal had inadvertently created a movement that was making elder abuse more difficult to perpetrate and easier to prosecute. Your Honor, Jessica's early release won't undo the harm she caused, but keeping her in prison longer won't create additional protections for vulnerable seniors, I concluded. I believe she should be released, but with the understanding that her actions have consequences that extend far beyond her personal punishment. The judge granted Jessica's parole with conditions that included community service at elder advocacy organizations and prohibition from any professional or personal involvement in elder care decisions. She would be released within 30 days to begin rebuilding a life that would be forever marked by her criminal conviction. After the hearing, Jessica approached me in the courthouse hallway, flanked by her attorney but clearly wanting to speak personally. We hadn't communicated directly since the confrontation in Robert's office over 2 years earlier, and the awkwardness was palpable "Mother, I know this doesn't change anything, but I need you to know that I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I convinced myself that I was protecting you, but I know now that I was really just protecting my own interests. What I did was unforgivable." Looking at her, I saw not the manipulative attorney who had orchestrated my imprisonment, but the scared little girl who had cried when her father died and clung to me for comfort and security. The years had taught me that people were capable of both terrible cruelty and genuine redemption, often within the same lifetime. "Jessica, forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't matter," I replied. "It's about choosing not to let someone else's mistakes define the rest of your life. I've built something meaningful from the ashes of your betrayal. What you do with your second chance is up to you." We didn't embrace or make promises about future contact. Too much had been broken for easy reconciliation. But there was a sense of closure, an acknowledgement that we were both different people than we had been 2 years earlier, shaped by trauma and consequences into something more complex than victim and perpetrator. 6 months later, I received an unexpected letter from Jessica. She had found work with a legal aid organization representing low-income seniors in guardianship disputes, using her understanding of elder abuse to help families navigate the same legal system that she had once manipulated. The irony was poetic. My former tormentor had become an advocate for the very people she had once victimized. "Margaret, look at this," Eleanor said, bursting into my office with a newspaper clipping and a grin that reminded me of a cat who had caught a particularly satisfying mouse. The Milwaukee nursing home case resulted in convictions on all counts: 15 years for the administrator, 12 years for the medical director, and complete asset forfeiture for the ownership company. The Milwaukee case had been one of dozens that followed our initial investigation, each building on the evidence and legal strategies we had helped develop. The cumulative impact was transforming the elder care industry, making exploitation more difficult and expensive while providing families with better protection and recourse. "Eleanor, we should add this to our impact report," I said, referring to the annual documentation we prepared, showing the broader effects of our advocacy work. "Senator Morrison's office wants updated statistics for the congressional hearing next month." Our impact report had become a powerful tool for legislative advocacy, demonstrating that effective elder abuse prevention was both morally necessary and economically beneficial. Facilities that operated ethically were more profitable in the RC. Long term, families that received proper support were less likely to resort to exploitation, and communities that protected their elderly members created stronger social bonds overall. The report for this year would show particularly impressive results. 47 facilities had adopted our transparency protocols. 8 states had implemented stronger guardianship oversight based on our recommendations, and federal prosecution of elder care fraud had increased by 300% since our initial case. "Margaret, sometimes I can't believe what we've accomplished," Eleanor mused as we reviewed the statistics together. 2 years ago, we were prisoners. Now we're changing national policy. The transformation had been remarkable, but it hadn't been easy. Building a successful elder care facility while simultaneously advocating for industry-wide reform required enormous energy and constant vigilance. There were setbacks, frustrations, and moments when the scope of the problem seemed overwhelming. But there were also victories that made every challenge worthwhile. Families reunited after being separated by exploitation. Seniors who regained control over their lives and finances. Young people who learned to value the wisdom and experience of older generations instead of seeing them as burdens to be managed. One of the most meaningful victories came when the state legislature passed the Elder Protection Act, comprehensive legislation that Eleanor and I had helped draft based on our experiences and research. The law strengthened oversight of guardianship arrangements, mandated financial transparency for family caregivers, and created dedicated prosecution units for elder abuse cases. This law will prevent thousands of cases like ours, Eleanor observed during the signing ceremony, where we had been invited as honored guests. It won't eliminate elder abuse entirely, but it will make it much more difficult to perpetrate and much easier to prosecute. The ceremony was attended by dozens of families who had been touched by elder abuse, many of whom had become advocates themselves after experiencing the trauma of betrayal by trusted relatives. The movement we had inadvertently started was now self-sustaining, with victims becoming advocates, and advocates creating systems that protected future victims. As I stood in the state capitol watching the governor sign legislation that bore the fingerprints of our suffering and determination, I thought about Harold and the life we had planned together. He would have been proud of what I had built from the ruins of Jessica's betrayal, proud that his widow had refused to be a victim and had instead become a force for justice. The evening after the bill signing, Eleanor and I sat in the garden at Sunset Manor, watching residents and their families enjoy the outdoor space we had created for genuine connection and relaxation. The atmosphere was everything that institutional elder care should be: dignified, respectful, and focused on enhancing life rather than managing decline. Eleanor, do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't fought back? I asked. If we had just accepted what our families did to us? I try not to think about that, she replied, but I suspect we would have deteriorated just like they expected us to. The system is designed to break people who resist, and it usually succeeds. Then we're living proof that the system can be beaten, even when it seems impossible. We're more than that, Margaret. We're proof that victims can become victors, that betrayal can become empowerment, and that individual courage can create systematic change. As the sun set over the facility that had been transformed from a prison into a sanctuary, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from broken victim to successful advocate. Jessica's attempt to bury me in an institution had instead given me a platform to fight for justice. Her greed had become the foundation for an enterprise dedicated to protecting the very people she had tried to exploit. The story wasn't really about revenge, though that had been satisfying. It wasn't even about forgiveness, though that had been healing. It was about transformation, about refusing to let someone else's cruelty define your future, and about finding ways to create meaning from suffering. 2 years ago, I had been Margaret Hayes, discarded mother and unwilling prisoner. Today, I was Margaret Hayes, facility owner and elder rights advocate. Tomorrow, I would continue the work of ensuring that other families never experienced the betrayal that had nearly destroyed me. The greatest victory wasn't that I had survived Jessica's attack on my freedom and dignity. The greatest victory was that I had transformed that attack into a movement that would protect other seniors for generations to come. She had tried to bury me, but instead, she had planted me. And from that planting had grown something far more powerful than she could ever have imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.